The Westminster Confession, or Westminster Catechism, number 7 says, God is a spirit, in and of himself infinite in being, glory, and blessedness, and all perfection, and all sufficient, eternal, unchangeable, incomprehensible, everywhere present, almighty, knowing all things, most wise, most holy, most just, most merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abundant in goodness and truth. And based on that, the larger catechism continues in number 12 and says, God's decrees, the things that he carries out, are wise and free, holy acts of the counsel of his will, whereby from all eternity he hath for his own glory unchangeably foreordained whatever comes to pass in time, especially concerning angels and men. In other words, God is sovereign over all of life, not just in biblical times, but he is sovereign over our lives today as well, as he works and moves throughout all of history, throughout all things, to move things toward his plan, his gospel plan of salvation and the fulfillment of that. And our text this morning will reveal that. Please open your Bibles with me if you have brought them, and I would encourage you to bring them each week. Take notes in them, write down things in them that God wants to show you and have you ponder later on to come back to. But if you have brought your Bibles with you this morning, please open with me to Genesis 25, 19 through 34. Genesis 25, 19 through 34, as we continue to work through this wonderful book section by section. This is the very word of God. These are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Paddan or Aram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. The children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it is thus, why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger." When her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out all red. All his body was like a hairy cloak. So they called his name Esau. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel. So they called his name Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once, when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted." Therefore, his name was called Edom. Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright now." Esau said, "I am about to die. What use is a birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me now." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Through this very human story that intentionally moves very quickly from marriage to pregnancy to birth to adult children, God taught Isaac and Rebekah, and he will teach us today, that he is sovereign over all things and he is good, ensuring that his story of redemption and his gospel plans for his people will be accomplished in his way and in his time. And nothing will ever thwart that. His plans will prevail throughout all history and in each of our lives when we follow him in faith. These verses begin a new section in the book of Genesis, which is indicated by the way it opens. These are the generations of Isaac, which is how Moses, the human author, under divine inspiration, structured the entire book of Genesis. As I mentioned when we first began studying the book, there are 10 of these throughout the book, and each serves almost like a chapter. Not only the start of a new section, but they are the start of a new divine initiative, or a major development, a major leap forward in the story of God. We have seen this a number of times up to this point. We have seen this, for example, with the beginning of creation and the lesson that God created everything good as a habitable place for us to have a relationship with God, to know him and to worship him. We've seen this with the section that begins on Adam and the fall, and the first promise of the gospel when Adam and Eve sinned and corrupted all of humanity, separating us from God. But God came and stepped in and revealed that he had a plan to send a Messiah to save us. We see this with a new section on Noah, where God showed us what we all deserve, that we all deserve death, but that we get something different through faith. And we saw this with the section that began with Abraham, where God revealed that he was going to create a nation of people, which the Messiah would eventually come through, and which was a type or a picture prophecy of what was to come in eternity. As Abraham looked forward to eternity, the book of Hebrews tells us. And now we are going to take another leap forward in this section over the next 11 chapters with Isaac and Jacob and his children, revealing that God is sovereign over all circumstances, including very difficult ones, including conflict and the messes that we create. In verse 20, we begin to see God's sovereign grace. We read, Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel. And we read that Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. Isaac had lived a life of faith for 40 years, and that taught him that he could trust in God's sovereignty with this problem. Isaac grew up hearing about God's call and God's work in his parents' lives, and how that advanced God's plan of salvation, promising his parents that he would work through them and through their offspring, and so that meant him as well. And he was taught that he was a miracle baby, which confirmed that he was the chosen one to carry on what God was going to do. As a teenager, he could have run past his elderly father when it appeared like his father was going to offer him as a sacrifice, and he was going to die. But Isaac trusted God, even to the point of having a willing attitude, as we have already seen. And here we read that he was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, which means he not only waited on God for a long time to provide for him a wife and a companion and a soulmate, and he kept his focus on God's plan and God's way of life during that time, that he lived a moral and upright life, shown by the fact that Isaac is the only patriarch who was monogamous. But even more important than that, it means that he waited on God to fulfill his promise, the promise that was given to Abraham, his father, but that included him. He waited on God to build this nation through him because he knew building a nation meant having a wife and having children. Throughout his life, he had learned that God was in sovereign control, and he built the habit of going to God in prayer. So when this new trial arose, we see that as how he handled it as well. In verse 21, we read, and Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. He knew the stories about his own miracle birth, but now this involved him and his wife. This was not a small trial, because being barren was a very big deal to them personally. Today, even in our anti-family culture, or our culture that is growing more and more that way, it seems every day, we know that this is a very big deal to people personally as well. The majority of people still desire to get married and raise children, and that is due to the fact that it is God's normative plan for the vast majority of people. As Genesis 1:28 tells us, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And today, when couples are not able to have children, it is a significant and personal pain for many of them, causing them to question if they are believers, to question God, to ask him why. So we can relate to this struggle today. It was also a big deal to them culturally speaking, because often older adults in their culture relied on their sons to provide for them and protect them, to care for them in their older age. And this also created a stigma or a social pressure on them, a theological reason as well. Since children are considered a blessing from God in the Old Testament scriptures, and since they are specifically mentioned as a covenant blessing, many people falsely concluded that being barren was always a type of punishment from God. So this was a painful trial for Isaac and Rebekah, not only internally, but also with them, with their culture around them, and socially speaking, as they battled stereotypes and misinterpretations of God's word. They would have desperately wanted to have children for personal reasons, but also because it was directly tied to God fulfilling the promise. It was also a painful trial because it was a long trial, just like it was for Isaac's parents. The opening of the story tells us Isaac was 40 when he got married, and verse 26 tells us Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So they had been waiting for 20 years. Waiting, as we all know, can be an incredibly difficult thing. And we can end up coming to all different kinds of wrong conclusions about why we are waiting. We know this was incredibly difficult for them based on what verse 21 tells us that Isaac did. And we don't really see this in our English translations, but it is seen in the word prayed. Isaac prayed to the Lord. The Hebrew word for prayed is a unique word that has the idea of pouring out one's heart and desperately pleading with God on behalf of another person. It is a word that is used by Pharaoh and Moses in Exodus 10:16 through 18, and that is the only other place that it is used. Where we read, the Pharaoh hastily called Moses and Aaron and said, I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Now, therefore, forgive my sin, please only this once, and plead, and there is the word, and plead with the Lord your God only to remove this death from me. And then we see, it says, so he, Moses, went out and pleaded with the Lord. So Isaac was not just praying casually, asking God as a part of a long list of things to end this trial for him, but he was pleading with God earnestly for 20 years, pouring out his heart, questioning. Have you ever prayed like that? Desperately prayed for something, knowing that God is the only one who is capable of answering, and there's absolutely no way that you can manipulate things or use your talents or your gifts, your skills to accomplish what needs to be done. You cannot solve the problem at hand. We don't pray like that as a church. The American church, I believe, has lost this. We need to get in the habit of praying like this again. Isaac prayed like that, knowing that the God he was praying to was the God who listened and cared. Isaac prayed like that, knowing that his prayers would not change the situation, but the God behind all things could. And today we need to learn to pray like that. After 20 years of wanting children, caring about the covenant promise of God, and waiting on God in dependent faith, verse 21 simply tells us, and the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. God is sovereign, we see here, over life and death, over every heartbeat, over the exact time that our heart begins to beat or stops beating. As Ecclesiastes 3 tells us, for everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die. And we see that that is in God's hands. Isaac and Rebekah's celebration was short-lived because the next trial came only a few months later. In verse 22, we read, the children struggled together within her, and she said, if it is thus, in other words, if it is from you, God, if this is your hand, if it is thus, why is this happening to me? So she went to inquire of the Lord. This was not normal baby movement in her womb, where the expectant parents are happy to feel a baby kick as if it's saying hello. The Hebrew word used for struggled here is very telltale. It has the idea of oppressing and crushing another person violently. The two twin brothers were actually fighting each other in Rebekah's womb, and they were fighting for months. Any mother knows how painful it can be when a baby puts pressure on her spine or kicks a rib. But this was violent fighting inside her womb, and anyone would question what was going on and be concerned, especially a first-time parent. Anyone would question what she does. Why me? And is this really from God? Which is exactly what she did. But since she also understood these children were an answer to prayer, she went to God in faith and in prayer. She knew it was something theologically significant, like a bad sign foreshadowing something to come. She must have been thinking, we prayed all these years, and this is how you answer our prayer? What's going on? Why does it seem like your blessing has turned into a curse? I'm sure I'm not the only one who has felt that way before. Rebekah went to the Lord in faith, and she asked, why is this happening? What is the meaning of this? And the Lord responded to her honest question in faith, not challenging him, but asking, wondering, leaning upon him. And he spoke to her directly, telling her he was aware of the situation. He was Lord over it, and also showing her that her situation did in fact foreshadow the future. It was a sign of what was to come. And so God gave this prophecy, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. And so she knew right then and there which one was the chosen one to carry on the promise, not which one was to be loved anymore like we see happening later on. She was to love and value both of them, but which one was chosen to carry on the promise? In other words, she is told, your 2 sons are fighting and they will continue to fight throughout their lives. At one point in chapter 27, we will see, it says, now Esau hated Jacob and planned to kill him. So what started in the womb carried on throughout their lives. But he also explained that it was bigger than the 2 of them. 2 different nations would arise from them, and their personal hostility would be passed on throughout all of the patriarchal history that we find in Genesis, and then carrying on afterward. From Jacob, the nation of Israel would arise, but from Esau and his intentional disobedience against God, the nation of Edom would arise. The nation that we read about in Numbers chapter 20. Became so hostile against God's people and against God that when they came out of the land of Egypt and they wanted to simply pass through the land of Edom, that they came out ready to fight and said, you cannot pass on the king's highway, even though that was a common highway for all different people to travel on. God told Rebekah the older would serve the younger. This was a prophecy clearly letting her know who was the chosen one to advance the Abrahamic covenant and the overarching covenant of grace, or the gospel. And that taught her that God's choice was not based on birth order, as she would have thought. It was not based on natural rights according to culture or any human convention, but it was solely based upon the plan and purpose of God. It taught her that God is sovereign and in control, and his plans will come to fruition and triumph over anything that will stand in its way. She did not have to fear what was happening in her womb because this was from God. Just as the Lord foretold the animosity and fighting would continue, when it came time to give birth, we see that that is exactly what happened. And that's why it says, behold, notice what God said, what he prophesied actually is coming true now. Verses 24 through 26 tell us Esau was born first, and then Jacob came out second with his hand holding Esau's heel. God used these true facts, the things that actually happened, as symbolism, showing that neither of the boys were commendable. Neither of the boys were worthy of being chosen by God to be the one who would carry on this promise. It was only his sovereign grace and mercy. The appearance of Esau symbolized the self-centered, wild, brute character that he would have. Now, this is a very different way of thinking. We don't tend to look at someone's appearance today and think thoughts like this, but this was something that God intentionally had happen in order to be a picture prophecy. And Jacob coming out grabbing his brother's heel showed the fighting actually continued right up to the end of the pregnancy. As Calvin said, his attempt to get out before his brother, an attempt to gain supremacy over his brother. The reality was these brothers did not like each other from the beginning. Their character was there in a seed-like form, and it only grew worse and worse as they grew older. And that showed that God did not choose either one due to any merit in them or due to any deserved gift or anything that was deserving or anything that God would owe them. It showed without the merciful, sovereign hand of God directing all things, over all things, moving all things towards his plan, that humanity would be without hope, because this was the next chosen one, and this one was not worthy. The boys grew up with very different characters and personalities, but both were driven by self, not faith at this point. In verse 27, we are told Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man dwelling in tents. In other words, Esau was a rugged outdoorsman who liked being out on his own. He was an individual. He liked dressing, if he were alive today, in things like jeans and flannels and hiking boots. He probably would have subscribed to backpacker and hunting magazines. He probably would have listened to country music. While Jacob was a quiet homebody who liked being by people. We see here he likes being in the kitchen. He probably would have subscribed to HGTV and Food and Wine magazine and listened to classical music. These short descriptions are meant in the scriptures by God to succinctly capture who these people are and to show us one point: they are polar opposites. I like both country music and classical, just to let you know. But here we see that these are complex people. These are people that are selfish too. Esau was the opposite of his brother. We see this work out in the text. He was loud and crass, and he lived for the moment. Jacob was quiet. He was a man who had foresight, but he was selfish, just like his brother. He was devious. He wanted future reward, but he wanted it for all the wrong reasons at this point. They both knew about God growing up with parents who had faith. They both knew about the promises, but neither were men of faith at this point. They were both living out their own selfish ambition, and their character even began to rub off on their parents, causing conflict to spread through favoritism, dividing husband and wife, parents and children, and we begin to see that there is a mess here that is brewing, a mess that will continue on for the next several chapters. It was a mess that would not get resolved until God stepped in, and I can't wait to get to that section a few chapters down the road. But God was still over it, working through it, even though it is not resolved in the story. Jacob might have believed in God and known about the prophecy that he was the chosen one, or he might not. We don't know exactly, but we can say probably. His parents were people of faith, and they would have trained him and raised him in that way. So he knew that there was a birthright that was there, at least culturally. He knew something theologically, even though we don't know the extent of it. But here we can say that whatever he knew, he wanted it for all the wrong reasons. He wanted supremacy over his brother. He wanted a place of power and position. He wanted inheritance and long-term prosperity. We can see this from a number of facts the Bible tells us. First, this birthright was different from any other family birthright in their culture because it included being the chosen one to carry on and advance God's story of salvation, which meant to be a blessing to everyone else. You didn't just receive this birthright for yourself, you received it for other people. So if he wanted it for God's reasons, if he was a follower of God at this point, he would have had God's heart with his brother in this story. He would have wanted his brother to know God. He would have treated him with love in a way that would lead his brother to God. But that was not the way he acted in the story or the stories to come. Instead, he mistreated and exploited his brother, and we don't see any remorse in this story. No repentance at all. Second, building the case that he was not a believer and that he did not want this for the right reasons. If he had saving faith, he would have been a man of prayer and reliance on God, just as we see in this text that his parents were. Trusting in God to provide him with the birthrights and the blessing that he would have known were his in God's way and in God's timing. That God's covenant blessings were meant to be received and not grasped, not something for him to manipulate things in order to try to get his way. And they were given to advance God's gospel for the benefit of everyone. They were not meant to be hoarded for self. They were never meant to cause harm to others. But we see here in this story that is completely lost on Jacob at this point. Third, Jacob lied and intentionally deceived his father to get the blessing later on after this story. His father had just asked Esau to go hunting for him and prepare his favorite meal, and then he was to come back and he was going to give the blessing, and we will dive into this shortly. But Jacob knew as soon as his brother Esau left that was his opportunity once again. Jacob brought the meal that his father had wanted, and he knew his father was blind, and so he could not see him and determine which son it was that was standing before him. And Jacob lied in Genesis 27:20, saying, "Because the Lord your God granted me success, I was able to get this food for you quickly." Because you see, his father said, "How is it that you brought this to me so quickly?" He knew his son just went out to go hunting. It would take him a while to get the animal. It would take him a while to come back and prepare that animal and then prepare the meal for him. But his other son just swooped in and brought that in. He was caught. And so in that moment, he says something that is very telltale about his heart. Because the Lord, your God, allowed me to do this. Your God, not my God. Because at this point, it was not his God. He was only using the name of God to manipulate his father, breaking 2 of the 10 commandments by dishonoring his father, and also, in doing that, taking God's name in vain. And that was Jacob's character. From the womb, grabbing at his brother's heel, both of them trying to crush each other in the womb, all the way up to that point. At this point in our story that is before us this morning, Jacob wanted what he wanted, and he waited for the perfect opportunity to grasp at it just like his brother's heel. And then one day it came. His brother had been out hunting, and despite being a skillful hunter, he spent all day and he came back home empty-handed. He was exhausted and extremely hungry. He says he was about to die, which could be literal, but I do not think that it is so. I think it is more akin to how we say, I am starving to death. I am really, really hungry. Because he was an adult, he was a skilled outdoorsman, he probably only went out that day to hunt. But even if he was out for several days, traveling over different parts of the land to go find animals, he would have brought food and water. Unless the famine that we read about in the opening verse of the next chapter was happening at this time. And we'll get to that next week, but I believe, like a lot of scholars, that the next story is actually out of order, and so it was not happening at this time. But either way, Esau was really hungry. And so he came in and he asked for stew, the stew that his brother was cooking. And Jacob saw his opportunity not to honor God, not to show his brother love and kindness, but to exploit his brother and fill his own selfish ambition. He did not have any compassion or understanding. And if his brother really was starving, then this becomes quite cruel as well. Jacob told Esau he would sell him the food in exchange for his birthright. He actually had no right to do that. And so he is violating all sorts of cultural customs. He is breaking apart and hurting his family, harming his whole family. He was not focused on God or eternity or the importance of the birthright and what it meant. But this sentiment went far beyond that moment or the immediate need. He did not care about the birthright in order to honor his family or the significance that God attached to it. By the rest of the story, we see clearly that both of these brothers did not think about this rightly. Jacob made Esau swear or take an oath that this transaction would be irrevocable. And we see here with Esau, that should have made him pause, but he didn't pause. He just went steaming on ahead. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. We're supposed to read this almost like it has sped up. It's all meant to be read just very, very quickly. In other words, all he was thinking about was his hunger, the immediate moment. He didn't care about anything else. And there was no repentance on his part either. As soon as he was satisfied, he got up and he left. As soon as he was satisfied, he didn't give a second thought to what he just did. And this is where the story ends, in a complete mess. And over the next few chapters, that mess will continue to grow. However, God worked through that mess we see here to accomplish his sovereign plan with the one he had chosen. And his work in Jacob's life was just getting started. And that shows us that God is in sovereign control, moving all things toward the fulfillment of his good plan and purpose. And nothing will get in the way, not even our sin or the messes that we create. And it shows us that God's choice to save a person is not based on that person or given as a reward for being a good or moral person. And the people that he chooses all the way through the Bible prove that point over and over again. Rather, God sovereignly chooses who he will save and gives them mercy and grace as an undeserved gift. And then he begins to change them, just as we will see that he will do in the life of Jacob over the next few chapters. As God will meet with Jacob first in a gospel dream, showing him his real need and what the real blessing is all about, and showing him what the inheritance is all about. That one day in the future, God was going to send the ultimate chosen son, the ultimate one who would fulfill prophecy, Jesus, who would come and open up the way to heaven through his perfect life, through his substitutionary death, and through his victorious resurrection, so that we could all be reconciled to God. And that is the point where Jacob comes to faith, and Jacob begins to change. Every one of us are a bigger mess than we realize, just like these two brothers. And at times we act like both of them. And every one of us would choose a bowl of soup over God if we were left to our own devices, as pathetic as that is. We need to let that sink in. The Bible tells us in Romans chapter 3 that every one of us has been corrupted, that there is something called total depravity, that every part of who we are has been tainted by sin, and that we would never choose God on our own. But it is only because of his grace. And in this story, we begin to see how amazing that grace is. And this story will only have power as you see these two brothers holding a mirror up to your own face. And then, as you turn and look up toward heaven, the one who is sovereign, the one who will work through the sin and the messes that we create, and that he will bring us to the place that we need to be brought to. God is still active and working in us, changing us as believers, sanctifying us, fitting us for heaven as he moves all of history toward the fulfillment of his plan and toward that great future that we have when we belong to him. Amen.